Hello, my name is Riley Sherman. I am a member of group number 5, which deals with the foundation of power and privilege. This foundation was built on Matt Clare's book, Privilege and Punishment, in which he discusses the inherent privileges that people can find within the court system, such as race, wealth, gender, all of these things. And he found that in his research, there are those who, despite having more knowledge of their rights as an individual or what court proceedings might look like, can be somewhat silenced and walked on within the judicial system simply because of their skin color. These people are born into situations where they get to see how people can be mistreated, and they learn what their rights are as an individual, and yet if they get into a situation themselves where they need to practice those rights and understand them, people tend to ignore what they're saying. And he finds that this is related directly to things like race, wealth, and gender, as I stated before. And so, as he discussed it, what came to my mind was Robert Heiner's theory of critical constructionism, which lies under the conflict paradigm, and it states that society is made up of social constructs, such as the court system with its laws and punishment and whatnot, education system, healthcare. All of these things are social constructs for the betterment of society. However, this theory states that some of these constructs might not be fair to the majority, in that they give inherent privileges to others and take away from some. And it states that because we as a society develop this, we should be critical of it and seek to change it to better accommodate the majority, those who deserve it just as much as others. And so as I did my research, I chose to focus on that critical viewpoint and those seeking to change society, not just examining it. And so to begin, one of my sources came from a woman named Angela Davis, who was once a lawyer and is now a professor. And she writes about things similar to Matt Clare in that she discusses wealth and privilege and power within the court system. She found that, similar to Matt Clare, white people, men, wealthy people tend to have more advantages in courts, tend to get lesser punishments, things like that. For example, she discusses a man named David McKnight, who had ample evidence against him that he murdered his Vietnamese roommate. In fact, the roommate stumbled into the street bleeding from wounds. McKnight had a knife, and yet when ambulances arrived, they took McKnight away and left the Vietnamese man to die in the street, essentially, because help didn't arrive in time. And yet, despite ample evidence being there, McKnight was able to get away with the murder, himself saying so in a bar later that night after he was acquitted. And so, in looking at this example, she sees that white privilege exists, and it's inherent. People can't change the color of their skin, yet if you're born in this certain race, you can have a better time within the court system than others who are just as deserving. And so she discussed that, and she's very critical of it, and she seeks to change it. She argues against it. And so she follows that theory, but rather than just focus on the court systems, I decided to look into other areas of society as well to see where people may be critical. And so one of the sources I found was on Democracy Now!, in which they discussed the Lancet report, which found that 40% of COVID-19 deaths could have been avoided. And what this essentially boils down to is that people just couldn't afford the treatment that they needed desperately to survive. And Dr. Mary Bassett, who discusses this report, argues that this is a broken system. These people shouldn't have to fend for themselves just to survive. These people could not simply afford to live in a case of a global pandemic where millions of people are suffering worldwide. She argues that at the very least, we need to be able to help these people survive, even if they can't afford it as an individual. She's very critical of the healthcare system that we have established, where it's essentially survival of the fittest in terms of monetary wealth. And so in the healthcare system, she's only one example of many who argues that what we have now isn't working for the majority of people. There are those who are born into wealth or are able to accrue it, and they can thus survive and afford all the health help they need. But to the majority, it's just not possible. And so there are many people critical of the system, and even powerful names like Bernie Sanders are seeking to change it in the modern day. And so that's another example of critical constructionism towards social constructs here in America. But one of the major aspects I looked at in my research was the idea of civil rights here in the United States. So one of the biggest names in recent decades for critical constructionists would be Rosa Parks, who, as many of us know, took place in the Montgomery bus boycotts, in which she refused to move from her seat in the front of the bus. Now, what makes this legacy so important, as Pamela Christian discusses, is the idea that she essentially took a position outside of the law and outside of society by doing that, because technically what she did was not legal. She essentially stood well outside what was the norm and what was allowed for her to show her criticism of the system and fight segregation as it was. And so she managed to risk herself. It was essentially a sacrifice in a way. Things turned out well in the end for her, but in the moment, no one could know how it might turn out. And so she attracted many other civil rights activists, and they experienced many successes, but even still, in modern American society, there are issues with civil rights. So I decided to look at Black Lives Matter to kind of build on that past. Now, they grew out of a group trying to end state-sanctioned police brutality into one that's trying to support society as a whole and make it better for LGBTQ, immigrants, anybody who's disillusioned with society. They're critical of the system, such as healthcare, such as education, such as the court system, and they're trying to create something that is better for everyone, not just the wealthy or those with white skin. And so in all of these examples, they're critical constructionists, and they seek to change the system. However, what's surprising about it is just how hard that is, how deeply ingrained power and privilege is in our societal constructs. These people have been fighting for decades and centuries, and yet they're having trouble finding success. And yet it's something that desperately needs to change, not just for people's wants and desires, but for necessity, for people to survive. And so in all of this, power and privilege has become deeply ingrained within the United States society, but there are plenty of people out there fighting to change it. And so that is my research, and I thank you for listening to me talk.